Theodore Robert Bundy, a name that still sends chills down the spine. Born November 24, 1946, this seemingly charming, intelligent man was, in reality, a monster. A predator lurking in plain sight. Between 1974 and 1978, he kidnapped, raped, and murdered dozens of young women and girls. And for years, he denied everything. But when the walls closed in, when he could no longer escape the truth, Ted Bundy finally confessed. He'd pretend to be injured, struggling with an arm in a sling, a leg in a cast, looking like a man in desperate need of help. Or he'd pose as an authority figure, a police officer maybe, someone trustworthy, someone safe. But safe is the last thing he was. Once he gained a woman's trust, he'd lead her to his car, parked somewhere just out of sight. And then, bam! He'd strike. A brutal, merciless blow to the head, leaving his victim unconscious before she even knew what was happening. From there, the horror only escalated. Handcuffs, restraints, a long, terrifying drive to a secluded location. And then, the unspeakable. Assault, torture, death. Ted Bundy was a wolf in sheep's clothing. A cold, calculating killer who moved through life wearing a mask of charm and normalcy. But behind those eyes, Bundy hinted, just hinted, to homicide detective Robert Keele that he had taken a life in Seattle in 1972, and another in 1973, a hitchhiker near Tumwater. But when pressed for details, he refused to elaborate. Robert Keele, the experts who studied Bundy the closest, they believed his killing spree may have started even earlier, when he was just a teenager. What we do know for certain is that his earliest documented murders took place in 1974. He was 27 years old, and by that time, he had perfected his craft.
We got a serial killer.
In an era before DNA profiling, Bundy had already mastered the art of covering his tracks, leaving behind little to no forensic evidence at his crime scenes. Ted Bundy knew exactly what he was doing, and he was just getting started. It was shortly after midnight on January 4th, 1974, right around the time he ended his relationship with Elizabeth Klopfer, when Ted Bundy struck again. He crept into the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks, a dancer, a student at the University of Washington, full of life, full of promise. She never saw him coming. Bundy bludgeoned her with a metal rod, a rod ripped straight from her own bed frame. But he wasn't done. He then sexually assaulted her with that same rod, causing devastating internal injuries. So severe, he ruptured her bladder. Karen Sparks survived, but the attack left her permanently changed. She spent 10 days unconscious in a hospital bed, and when she awoke, she had severe brain damage. Her vision and hearing, never the same. But Bundy wasn't finished. Just 4 weeks later, in the early morning hours of February 1st, he broke into another basement room, this time targeting 21-year-old Linda Ann Healey. Linda was a University of Washington undergraduate, a bright young woman who broadcasted morning weather reports for local skiers. She was loved, she was trusted. Bundy beat her unconscious. Then, with cold, methodical precision, he dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse, and boots. And then, he carried her away. Later, he would casually admit what he had done. He drove Linda to a secluded location, raped her, murdered her, and dumped her body, as if she were nothing more than an afterthought. But this was only the beginning. On March the 12th, Donna Gail Manson, just 19 years old, left her dorm at Evergreen State College in Olympia. She was on her way to a jazz concert, but she never arrived. What happened to Donna? Bundy later claimed that in a moment of paranoia, an obsession with cleanliness, he burned her skull in his girlfriend's fireplace, down to the last ash. Then, on April the 17th, 18-year-old Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared. She had been walking back to her dorm room after an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College. 2 female students would later recall something chilling. A man, wearing a sling, struggling with a load of books, near a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle, asking for help. On May 6th, Roberta Kathleen Parks, 22 years old, left her dorm at Oregon State University. She was going to meet friends for coffee. She never made it. Bundy later confessed. He had spotted her in the cafeteria. He lured her in. He tied her up. He gagged her. Then, he drove her all the way back to Washington, where she met her fate, and the cycle continued. On June 1st, Brenda Carol Ball, 22 years old, was last seen in the parking lot of the Flame Tavern near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She had been talking to a man, a brown-haired man, with his arm in a sling. Bundy would later claim they had a consensual sexual encounter before he strangled her. But investigators were skeptical. Her skull had been severely damaged. This was no ordinary strangulation. In the early morning hours of June 11th, 18-year-old Jorann Hawkins was walking down a well-lit alley between her boyfriend's dorm and her sorority house. She never made it home. By morning, 3 Seattle homicide detectives and a criminalist were on their hands and knees, combing through that alleyway, desperate to find anything. They found nothing. Later, Bundy would chillingly recount the details. He had lured Jorann to his car. He had knocked her unconscious with a crowbar. He had handcuffed her and driven her to Issaquah, 20 miles east of Seattle. And there, he strangled her. But what he did next, it left investigators stunned. The next afternoon, as police were actively investigating her disappearance, Bundy walked right back to that same alley. He retrieved her earrings and one of her shoes. He had carelessly left them behind in the parking lot. And then, he simply walked away, unnoticed. As Robert Keele later wrote, "It was a feat so brazen that it astonishes." Reports of the brutal attack on Sparks and the 6 missing women appeared prominently in newspapers and on television. Throughout Washington and Oregon, fear spread like wildfire among the population. Hitchhiking by young women dropped sharply. Pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies, but the scarcity of physical evidence severely hampered them. Police refused to provide reporters with the little information they did have, fearing it could compromise the investigation. On February 15th, at 1 a.m., Pensacola police officer David Lee spotted Bundy's stolen vehicle. The wants and warrants check came back. The car was stolen. Lee pulled Bundy over, but as soon as Lee tried to arrest him, Bundy attacked. He kicked the officer's legs out from under him, and he ran. Lee fired 2 warning shots. Then he tackled him to the ground. They struggled, fought, wrestled over Lee's gun, but Lee won. Bundy was subdued, handcuffed, arrested. In the stolen vehicle, they found everything: 3 sets of IDs belonging to Florida State University students, 21 stolen credit cards, a stolen television set, and the final proof, a disguise. the dark-rimmed glasses and plaid slacks worn by Richard Burton Fire Department. The same disguise he wore when he tried to lure Leslie Parmenter. In May 1978, a Florida grand jury indicted Bundy on charges of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and burglary. His first trial was in June 1979. It was nationally televised. The entire country was watching. Despite having 5 attorneys, he handled his own defense. But in the end, the jury took less than 7 hours to decide. Guilty. The sentence? Death.